My mother-in-law casually dropped a surprise on me. We're going to be living together now. We just remodeled the house into a duplex for convenience. Since the property is in your name, right? Emma, could you cover the $80,000 remodeling bill? My mother-in-law and my husband laughed, pleased with themselves. Watching them, I felt a surge of determination. I was about to confront them with a truth even my husband didn't know, along with some evidence. I'm Emma Davis, 26 years old. I live in a quiet, nature-filled area outside the city, working an office job and enjoying drawing as a hobby. Recently, I've been uploading my art to social media, and I love reading people's comments on it. My husband is 3 years older than me, and we're happily married, living in a cozy old farmhouse we bought right after the wedding. But since we got married, we've had a monthly visitor who always brings stress along with her, my mother-in-law. Emma, I'm here, open up, she shouted, banging on the door. I quickly opened it, trying to smile. Coming, mother-in-law, though there's a doorbell, she never uses it. There are so many bugs around here. Where's George? Still at work, poor thing. Even on a Saturday, I brought him some of his favorite food. She stood there holding a large bag, looking a little annoyed. I kept my forced smile as she chatted non-stop. My husband is her only child, so she feels the need to take care of him constantly, even after he got married. She even helps me with house chores, like the time she rearranged everything in the fridge, and I had to hunt for ingredients the next day. Before our wedding, my husband told me, if my parents ever need help, we'll live together. I want you to be okay with that. I didn't like the idea of leaving our beloved farmhouse, but I had accepted it. What worried me more, though, was the idea of living with my mother-in-law full-time. 2 years into our farmhouse life, my husband told me that his father had fallen and broken his leg. They need our help now, so let's live together like we discussed, he said. Yes, I think it's the right thing to do. Can I still keep up with my drawing hobby? I asked, worried about losing my free time. I agreed to move in with them, mostly because I was concerned for my father-in-law, but I felt anxious that housework and taking care of my in-laws might take away from my precious drawing time. Whether my husband knew about my anxiety or not, he just said, I want you to prioritize the house, and then left the room to go to his office. Alone in my room, I felt like I had almost given up on my self-centered husband. Looking at the illustrations I'd drawn over the years, I began to reflect on my feelings. Just as I had convinced myself to live with my in-laws, something unexpected happened. While at work one day, I suddenly felt numbness in my hands and feet, followed by intense dizziness, and I collapsed. Thankfully, a colleague called an ambulance immediately, so I was safe, but I was diagnosed with a stroke at a young age. I regretted ignoring my high blood pressure, which I'd noticed during health checks but never seriously addressed. I was told I'd need surgery, rehabilitation, and a hospital stay that would last about 2 months. As my diagnosis sunk in, I took out my phone and called my husband, my hands trembling. All he said was, I see, so I guess living together will be postponed, huh? I was crushed to realize he was more worried about moving in with his parents than about my health. With my father-in-law still in the hospital for his broken leg, there was no immediate need for caregiving, so I could focus on my recovery. Since we didn't have kids yet, there were no additional worries there. Still, I remembered my mother-in-law's constant wish for grandchildren, which she mentioned every time we met. Trying to shake off the thought, I picked up my sketchbook. Between preparing to move in with my in-laws and all the medical tests after my collapse, I hadn't had time to draw. I realized that once I started living with them, I'd probably have even less time. So, I decided to treat this hospital stay as my last chance for some freedom and fully enjoy my hobby. Once I was out, I promised myself I'd do my best for my husband and his parents, whether with housework or anything else. The 2 months passed quickly, and soon it was time for me to leave the hospital. My husband casually asked if I wanted him to pick me up, but I wanted some time alone, so I declined. As I sat on the bus, watching the familiar scenery go by, I realized I was close to home. The sunlight sparkled on the green leaves, and I felt a bittersweet sadness, knowing I'd be leaving this beautiful, peaceful place soon. Since my in-laws' house was closer to the city center, I knew my life was about to change dramatically. Feeling a bit sad, I slowly got off the bus at the familiar stop. As I walked toward our old home, I suddenly froze in my tracks. The charming, old house I loved was gone. In its place stood a completely unfamiliar, remodeled house. Since I'd been in the hospital for 2 months, I wondered if I was confused about the location, but after checking the nearby buildings, I knew I was in the right place. There was no mistake. Feeling unsettled, I nervously pressed the intercom. My husband's voice answered, "Yes?" Recognizing him, I replied, "It's Michelle." A moment later, he opened the door, looking casual and slightly disheveled. "Ah, welcome home. You're back sooner than I thought," he said, sounding relaxed. "I could have picked you up today. I had the day off." "George, what happened to our house? Why does it look so different?" I asked, barely able to hide my shock. But George just looked at me blankly, saying, "Huh? What's up? What do you mean?" Then I heard laughter coming from inside. Dread filled me, and I walked past George, heading toward the living room. Opening the door to the unfamiliar living room, I saw my mother-in-law lounging on the couch, laughing at something on the TV. She looked up and said, "Oh, Michelle, welcome back. Those hospital stays are so long, aren't they?" "Don't worry, I took care of the house while you were gone." My heart sank as I asked her why the house looked so different. Without a trace of guilt, she explained, "Well, since we're all going to live together now, I just remodeled it into a duplex to make things more comfortable." The phrase, "just remodeled it into a duplex," kept echoing in my mind. My mother-in-law was always interfering in our lives, but I never thought she'd actually remodel the house without asking. Weren't we supposed to move in with her and her house closer to the city? She always complained about the bugs and the distance from the station here. But now, she smiled and turned off the TV, leaning in to say, "Oh, there's something else important to tell you. The remodeling was a bit expensive. Michelle, the title of this house is under your name, right? Sorry, but could you cover the payment?" She laughed without a trace of regret. "It's $80,000. Her words hit me like a punch, and I felt my legs shaking. I couldn't even respond. She just stood there smiling, and at that moment, my husband walked in. I rushed over, hoping he'd understand my shock. I told him what his mother had said, desperate for his support. But his answer was as cold as ever. "Well, that sounds right. Go ahead and cover it, okay?" That was it. This was the same man who cared more about living arrangements than my health when I had a stroke. He always went along with whatever his mother said, never questioning her. The frustration I'd been feeling toward him flooded over me, and I felt completely done. From the bottom of my heart, I knew I was ready to leave this family. "George, I understand now," I said. "I'm going to divorce you. And, Cecilia," I added, looking at my mother-in-law, "you can take care of the renovation costs on your own." I turned to leave, but they weren't about to let me go so easily. My husband sneered, "Fine, I've been losing interest in you anyway, but remember, the house is in your name, so you're responsible for the payment." "Yeah, leave if you want, but pay your dues first," my mother-in-law added smugly. Their selfish demands shocked me. I couldn't help but sigh. I refused to turn around, knowing I'd see their smug, satisfied faces. Standing tall, I replied, "You both keep saying the house is in my name. Did you forget? The ownership was transferred to you, George." I revealed the truth to them, but they only laughed, assuming I was lying to avoid paying. That's when I reminded them that George had asked me to transfer the property title to his name when we got married, saying he didn't want the house to be in his wife's name for appearance's sake. I didn't care much about it, so I'd agreed and transferred the ownership to him. Their smug laughter stopped instantly, and I could see panic setting in. "I don't remember asking for that, and you don't have any proof," George said, trying to deny it. Anticipating this, I calmly walked over to an old drawer, pulled out the property document, and held it up to their faces, pointing to the line that showed George's name as the owner. My husband's face turned pale. "That's fraud. I can't believe you actually did it," he stammered, realizing the $80,000 remodeling bill would fall on him. His sudden anger disgusted me. Realizing a calm conversation was impossible, I said, "We'll communicate through lawyers from now on." I turned to my mother-in-law and added, "Cecilia, your son seems to be in quite a bind, so please take care of him." Ignoring my husband's yelling, I left their house for good. Afterward, my husband tried calling several times, but I didn't respond. Everything was handled through my lawyer, and given our already strained relationship and issues with his mother, the divorce went through smoothly. My husband's claim that the name change was fraud was dismissed since it was proven that we had agreed to the transfer 2 years ago when we got married. My lawyer reassured me that it was entirely legal. It turned out they had intended for me to cover the remodeling costs immediately after my release from the hospital, an effort to burden me financially at my weakest. Instead, since the house was under my husband's name, he was responsible for the bill, essentially trapping himself in the end. I also received alimony as part of the divorce settlement. Burdened by the large payment he now couldn't avoid, George either borrowed from risky lenders or found himself struggling with debt. While I was dealing with my husband and mother-in-law schemes, I received an apology from my father-in-law, Bob, who was still in the hospital with a broken leg. He messaged me, saying, "I'm sorry for my wife and son's behavior." I could tell that Bob wasn't directly involved, but he had still ignored his wife's and son's treatment of me during the 2 years of our marriage. After replying briefly, I made up my mind to cut all ties with that family and move on with my life. Since then, my health has gradually improved, and I was able to go back to work. During my marriage, I used to draw carefully, always worried about my husband's reaction, but now, I can dive into my art freely, anytime I want. What started as just a hobby has turned into a career. People now reach out to me with job offers through the social media site where I post my illustrations. I now spend more time drawing for work than just for fun. Today, I'm on my way to visit an old farmhouse in a small, rural town. My dream now is to buy this house with a mix of my alimony and savings, then open an art studio there. As I ride the bus, looking out at the scenery, I remember the day I left the hospital, a day that changed everything for me. The beautiful natural landscape around me looks just as it did that day, but my feelings are completely different. I'm filled with excitement and hope for the new life ahead, and the sunlight streaming through the trees makes the leaves look so bright they're almost dazzling.
After giving birth, I came back home from the hospital, but when I tried to use my key, it didn't work. "Oh, you got discharged today," my husband said casually. "I thought you weren't coming back, so I changed the locks. You can't get in anymore." At that moment, it hit me. We were already like strangers, and he had already started the divorce process. He blamed me, saying if I had apologized earlier, things wouldn't have escalated. He hung up, leaving me with my newborn and a useless key. Anger boiled inside me at how he treated me throughout our marriage. He probably expected me to beg for forgiveness and beg to be let back in. Maybe I would have in the past, but not anymore. He didn't deserve to be a husband or a father. Deciding I wouldn't let him off easily, I resolved to take action. My name is Natasha, a full-time homemaker, 3 months pregnant. I had to quit my job when I got pregnant, something my husband insisted on so I could focus on being a homemaker. While I was happy about the pregnancy, I was also confused. Getting pregnant just 3 months after marriage wasn't what I expected. I wanted to enjoy being newlyweds with my husband, and I always wanted siblings for myself. My husband was thrilled about the pregnancy, eagerly awaiting our baby's arrival every day. But amidst the happiness, there were many difficulties. Shortly after discovering my pregnancy, my morning sickness hit hard. It got so severe that I struggled to even sit up, let alone do any household chores. The house started to get messy, and I couldn't manage even simple tasks. While my husband didn't say anything directly, his dissatisfaction was evident. It seemed to start when I began sleeping early due to the sickness, missing his return from work. "I want the room cleaned up. There's too much dust," he complained one day, frustrated. "And I prefer homemade food over delivery all the time." We're newlyweds, but is this how it's going to be? His words stung, especially on his day off. Suppressing the urge to snap back, I smiled and explained, "I've been struggling with morning sickness since the beginning. I'd really appreciate your help." I hoped he'd understand, now that he was going to be a father soon. But his response disappointed me. "Pregnancy and childbirth are a mother's job," he said dismissively. "There's nothing I can do. You have to handle it until the baby is born." Feeling a mix of frustration and disappointment, I held back my retort, reminding myself that the baby could hear. Instead, I silently praised myself for keeping my cool. "Fathers can spoil the child once they're born," he added casually before leaving for lunch, leaving me alone with my thoughts. Lately, my husband has been going out to eat often and returning late without even bringing something back for me. I don't hate him. I married him because I love him. But he doesn't take care of himself, and when things don't go his way, he sulks like a child. For instance, before we got married, there were times I had to cancel our dates because of work. He'd get upset every time, and I'd try to cheer him up by treating him or comforting him. Even when he visited my place, He'd complain about things not being perfect, like the cleaning or the food, but back then, I could laugh it off. He'd even stay over for weeks without helping with any chores. Back then, maybe it was my maternal instincts kicking in or finding him charming, but I ended up marrying him. But as we started living together, I began to notice his flaws more and more. Despite seeing his negative side, I kept quiet, hoping things would improve once the baby arrived. But I was wrong. Before I knew it, I had drifted off, lost in thoughts about our situation. When I woke, it was already dark, and my husband still hadn't returned from lunch. I felt a mix of relief and emptiness as I glanced around the messy room. Thoughts of divorce crept into my mind. But then I'd think about our unborn child and wonder if that was the right decision. Overthinking left me feeling more depressed, unable to move. Days passed, and I remained lost in these thoughts, feeling increasingly uneasy. Then, while eating with my swollen belly, I suddenly felt water trickling down my legs. Could it be my water breaking? Panic set in as I hurried inside to check. As I began to feel pains in my belly, despite it being a few days before my due date, fear gripped me, and I called my husband, who was still at work. Despite the pain of labor, my husband didn't show concern when I called him, scolding me for not sticking to the schedule. He had promised to leave work and be there when I went into labor, but now that wasn't happening. Deciding not to dwell on his absence, I focused on giving birth safely. Calling for an ambulance, I made it to the hospital. Even after arriving, the pain persisted, but eventually, I gave birth to our child. My mother and mother-in-law rushed over, praising me. But when my mother-in-law realized my husband still hadn't shown up, everyone began to worry. I, too, had forgotten about him amidst the chaos. Calling him, I asked him to come to meet our newborn. But instead of rushing to the hospital, he demanded an apology, blaming me for giving birth earlier than planned. He even accused me of ruining his schedule. He refused to come, citing work. His callous response crushed me, and I couldn't hold back tears. I explained the situation to my confused parents and in-laws, revealing his recent behavior. Anger flared among them, and my in-laws apologized, but my feelings towards my husband had already cooled completely. I'm considering divorcing him, I confided to my parents. Natasha, that's not something you need to apologize for. My mother reassured me. It's important to follow your heart. Relieved by their support, I still felt guilty for my baby. Tears flowed once again as I cried through the night after everyone left. As I tried to navigate breastfeeding and caring for my newborn, alone in the room, my mother-in-law paid me a visit. After cooing over her grandchild, she began to share details about my husband's childhood. Growing up as a latchkey kid, my husband faced loneliness at home while his parents worked. Though they taught him to be independent, he struggled with the solitude, often crying and causing trouble for his parents. They had to rely on relatives and friends to care for him until they could pick him up. Despite their efforts to encourage independence, he resisted, refusing to heat up his own food or be left alone. Eventually, they sent him to cram school, hoping it would lessen his time alone at home. However, even after being sent to cram school, my husband still resisted the idea of coming home alone. Instead of preparing meals himself, he used pocket money to buy food before and after cram school. When his parents picked him up, he expected them to cook for him. He had been living selfishly, avoiding housework and relying on his parents' care. He admitted, "I hate being alone because I can't do anything on my own." He chose his university and workplace based on their proximity to home, further relying on others. My mother-in-law, feeling sorry for the situation, confessed that they had raised him wrongly. She hoped he would change after marriage and becoming a father, but he hadn't. Feeling strangely in agreement, I realized I hadn't discussed our situation with my in-laws. Unintentionally, I opened up to my mother-in-law about it. Later that night, while trying to rest between nursing sessions, my husband called accusing me of talking to his parents to get back at him for not visiting. Angered by his response, I muttered insults silently, finding solace in my sleeping baby as I eventually drifted off to sleep. As I left the hospital, my husband still hadn't visited our baby even once. Despite feeling a sense of relief, I couldn't shake the strange refreshment as I took a taxi home. To my surprise, the taxi driver helped me with my luggage and accompanied me to the door. As we chatted, I attempted to unlock the door, but the key wouldn't fit. It seemed the cylinder had been changed. Only my husband could have done this. Suppressing my anger, I called him, and this is what he said. "Oh, you got discharged today, but this isn't your home anymore. This is my house, and you and I are already strangers. I've already filed for divorce. If you had apologized right away, it wouldn't have come to this. Don't you ever contact me again." With his usual callousness, he hung up, leaving me stunned and hurt. Realizing I couldn't risk taking my infant outside for long, I immediately reached out to my mom and explained the situation. After hanging up, the observant taxi driver, who had been witnessing everything, returned my luggage to the car and even opened the door for me. His unexpected enthusiasm made me smile, perhaps echoing the sentiment of Schadenfreude, finding joy in the misfortune of others. Arriving at my parents' house, I entrusted my child to my mom's care and sought legal advice. The lawyer listened to my story and confirmed my decision for divorce. Despite my emotions running wild, I recounted everything that led to this point. The divorce papers had been submitted without my consent, leading us into a mediation process. If we couldn't reach an agreement, court was the next step. But my mind was made up. It wasn't just about being insulted. It was about my husband's neglect towards our child and locking us out of the house. I couldn't let such behavior go unchecked, especially with a baby to protect. I instructed my lawyer to seek compensation for the emotional distress during pregnancy, child support, and property division. I knew my husband wouldn't agree to mediation, and even if we did, I doubted we'd find common ground. The lawyer explained the mandatory mediation before legal action, which dampened my spirits momentarily. But this was no longer just about me. It was about securing a future for my child. Rather than endure silently, I decided it was time to fight. Despite my husband's deceit with fake divorce papers, my intention for divorce remained firm. He deserved to face the consequences of his actions. "I'm filing a complaint against my husband," I informed my lawyer. Shortly after, my husband was arrested by the police. It emerged that he had been cheating on me with another woman in a different house. Apparently, he had changed the locks right after I was hospitalized and had been living there proudly. However, he couldn't handle the chores or the mess and odor, so he moved in with his mistress. Living carefree there, he was caught off guard when the police arrived and arrested him. When I informed my in-laws about consulting with a lawyer, they tried to contact my husband but couldn't reach him. He hadn't returned to his parents' house either. They never suspected he would cheat, but it had been going on for months. Reflecting on it, there were signs. He'd often leave during the day and return late, claiming overtime. But with my morning sickness and dealing with his selfishness, I perhaps turned a blind eye, preferring the solitude. During the legal proceedings, my husband blamed me, portraying himself as a victim. But his childish behavior only worsened the situation. Eventually, he apologized, admitting his mistakes and expressing a desire to start over and see our baby. I heard all of this through my lawyer, and his request to clean up for once sparked the most intense irritation I had ever felt. That apology, coupled with his selfish demand, topped all the irritation I had ever felt. I instructed my lawyer to convey this message to him, ensuring he understood my feelings. After that, things finally reached a conclusion. Surprisingly, I received a fair share of the property and even more compensation for emotional distress than I had anticipated, despite my husband's infidelity. The house was in his name, so I willingly gave it up without hesitation. Frankly, I had no desire to deal with a messy, foul-smelling house. Regarding child support, it was agreed upon that he would pay monthly. However, I learned from my mother-in-law that he quit his job and resorted to part-time work after the incident became known at his company. He attempted to return to his parents' home, but his father refused him entry. Consequently, he sold our former house and relocated elsewhere. Considering his situation, I didn't hold high expectations for child support. However, my in-laws generously offered to assist for the sake of their grandchild, separate from my husband's payments. While I couldn't bring myself to accept money from them, I expressed my gratitude for their kind gesture. Now I'm back at my parents' house, taking time to rest and recuperate with their support. Eventually, I plan to move out with my child and start working toward a modest but happy life. I'm determined to do my best for both of us. My husband Derek called me suddenly, sounding urgent. He sent a picture that left me stunned. Our family home, the one I grew up in, was being torn apart. My name's Kim, and I live with Derek and his mom Mary. I met Derek at work, but I quit after we got married to focus on homemaking. Turns out, Derek seemed sweet before we tied the knot. But he's really a mama's boy. Living with Mary brought out his true colors. He's always putting her first, even over me, his wife. Mary basically runs our household, making all the decisions about everything from decor to meals. I'm left doing all the chores like her servant. Derek doesn't seem to care how tired or unhappy I am. I'm starting to think I married him just to look after Mary. She's getting more arrogant by the day, never openly mean in front of Derek, but constantly making me feel small when we're alone. I can handle some of her insults and the silent treatment, but it's wearing me down. One day, Mary crossed a line. She called my freshly brewed coffee disgusting and splashed it in my face, almost burning me. That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. Tearfully, I told Derek everything when he got home, hoping for support. But he just shrugged it off, saying his mom was just in a bad mood. The next day, Mary was even worse, clearly having heard about our conversation. "How dare you tell my son about our little argument?" she sneered. Then she started attacking my parents, questioning my upbringing. It was too much. I couldn't stand her insults toward my loving parents any longer. I suggested to Derek that we live separately from Mary, but he refused, saying he couldn't disrespect his mom like that. So I made my decision. "Fine, then I'll move out," I said without hesitation. I didn't want to stay in a place ruled by Mary's taste any longer. I quickly filed for divorce and arranged a weekly apartment contract. It took some time to finalize everything, but I knew it was the right decision for my own sanity. The next morning, I left the divorce papers on the table and hurriedly left the house. I really didn't want to go back to my parents' home. I knew Derek might check there first if he came looking for me. I didn't want to cause unnecessary worry or trouble for my parents, so I rushed my move to avoid any further interference from Derek. Afterwards, I arranged a trip for my parents as a gift, using some savings I had from before I got married. My parents were hesitant, but I insisted and sent them on a trip to San Francisco. They deserved some enjoyment, especially since I hadn't been able to properly show my gratitude to them after getting married and always dealing with Mary and Derek. With my parents away, they wouldn't have to deal with Derek causing them any trouble, at least for a while. I was starting to adjust to my new life in the weekly apartment when Derek suddenly called. He had tried several times since I left, but I had ignored all his calls. Reluctantly, I answered the phone, wondering why Derek was calling now. To my surprise, he sounded cheerful, asking how I was. Cautiously, I replied, "What do you want?" He continued unapologetically, saying, "I'm having your family home demolished right now." I fell silent, not understanding what he meant. Demolished? Did you say demolished, like destroying? What on earth are you talking about? Don't mess with me, I retorted, still not grasping the meaning of his words. He remained nonchalant, saying, "Yeah, I'm selling the land your family home is on to buy my mom a luxurious house." His nonsensical statements left me speechless. With a smug tone, he added, "We're married, so it's shared property, right?" Then he hung up the phone, leaving only the cold electronic disconnected tone. I couldn't believe the ridiculous logic he was using. It sounded like something out of a science fiction movie. I couldn't tell if it was a prank or if he was serious, so all I could do was stare at my silent phone. Then, a notification popped up, a picture from Derek. When I opened it, I saw a house being torn down, its white walls and blue roof just like my family home. I felt the blood drain from my face. Furious, I tried calling him back, but he completely ignored me. Collapsing onto the floor, I couldn't help but feel overwhelmed. Later, I discovered what had transpired after I left. Derek, as expected, went to my parents' house, only to find out from a neighbor that they were on vacation. The neighbor also mentioned that I hadn't returned home. This news seemed to enrage Derek. He saw it as unfair that my parents were away while I was elsewhere. In a fit of anger, he decided to demolish the house as revenge. Sadly, neither my parents nor I were there to prevent it. Moreover, he hadn't submitted the divorce papers yet, assuming he could do whatever he wanted with my property since we were still legally married. I called my sister, who still lived at the family home, barely able to contain my worry. I couldn't fathom how Derek managed to do it, but if he forcefully demolished the house with her inside, I dreaded to think what could have happened to her. I anxiously waited for my sister to answer. After several rings, she picked up in a relaxed tone, asking what was wrong. Despite my urgency, her attitude remained unchanged, making me feel like I might be overreacting. I hurriedly asked about the house, but my sister's response was unexpected. "Oh, the house. Keith across the street seems to be having some renovation work done or something, but our house is fine." I couldn't believe it, but it had to be the explanation. After a moment of silence, it hit me. The house across the street from ours, where Keith, who had always been kind to us, lived, looked just like ours. Our last names were the same, leading to frequent mix-ups with Christmas cards and visitors. In other words, the house Derek claimed to have demolished was Keith's. I was struck with disbelief. Talking about it gave me a headache. Having our house destroyed would be terrible enough, but accidentally demolishing the neighbor's house was no laughing matter. I quickly explained the situation to my sister and rushed to our family home. Together, we headed to Keith's house. It appeared that Derek and the contractors had already left, leaving the house completely demolished. My sister and I turned pale as a man with an exotic appearance, dragging a suitcase, appeared while letting out a bizarre scream. "My house is gone." It was Keith, who had just returned from an overseas trip. His wide eyes mirrored our shock. Exchanging glances, my sister and I apologized profusely. We explained the situation in detail, but it all sounded like excuses. We couldn't help but feel sorry for involving him in all of this. "We're so sorry that your precious house ended up like this." We continued to apologize. We knew that saying sorry wasn't enough, but it was all we could do for now. Keith seemed shocked by the sudden turn of events. When we apologized, Keith lifted his face and spoke kindly, reassuring us, "It's not your fault. There's someone else who needs to take responsibility." Though his tone was gentle, his eyes held a serious demeanor. He suggested a plan to make things right. A few days later, Derek appeared in front of the demolished house with the contractors. I had called him there, taking a gamble on whether he would come or not. Perhaps he was intimidated by the formal protest, or maybe he just wanted to see my distressed face. Either way, he agreed to come. Accompanied by my sister, Keith, and a lawyer, I went to meet him. Derek seemed surprised to see me with allies, but he quickly put on a brave face. "What do you want now? Nothing can be done about the demolished house. Besides, it's our shared property as a married couple. You have no right to complain." Derek still didn't know the truth. Responding with a hint of pity, I told him, "The house you destroyed wasn't my family home. It was Keith's house." As I introduced Keith, Derek visibly shrank back, intimidated by Keith's anger, which was unusual for the typically gentle man. Derek tried to argue back, saying, "But your maiden name is Jackson, right? I checked properly before demolishing it." Hearing that he had demolished someone else's house, Derek started to panic. I sighed, as if to interrupt him, explaining, "It's not that unusual of a last name. We just happen to live in a similar house and have the same last name. But what are the odds?" Despite being genuinely upset, Derek's response sounded almost like a comedic retort in the midst of the tense situation. My sister chuckled beside me, finding the situation amusing. "This is hilarious," she remarked. Ignoring her, I continued. "Besides, do you even understand what shared property means? My family's land isn't part of our shared property. Maybe you should ask this lawyer here for some advice." At my signal, the lawyer handed Derek a business card. Derek seemed surprised, apparently not realizing he was a lawyer, and stared at the card. My sister leaned in, mockingly addressing Derek. "Don't you know Keith Jackson of our city? He's a famous landowner around here." Indeed, Keith was not just an ordinary man. As my sister later explained, he used to be an executive at the company where Derek worked, the same company where I met him. Sometimes Keith's eyes would lose their warmth, and his expressions carried an aura of influence. "It's not my fault." Derek finally seemed to realize the gravity of the situation. His previous boldness was replaced by a panicked demeanor. Unfortunately, the contractors, who should have been his only allies, fled as soon as they heard Keith's story. They were the kind who would demolish a house without proper investigation. Derek must have been caught by a fraudulent contractor. "Enough already?" Keith, seeming to have run out of patience, yelled at Derek. The air seemed to tremble with the force of his anger. "Admit your wrongdoing without any excuses, or do you want to involve the police?" At these words, Derek became completely subdued. In the end, with a lawyer present, he agreed to our side's demands, and the situation was settled. Derek signed the divorce papers and was forced to write a letter stating that he would pay compensation to both Keith and me. The compensation amount was quite significant due to the demolition of the house, and Derek had already incurred debt for the demolition costs. The unscrupulous contractor had taken the money and disappeared without a trace, leaving Derek with no one to rely on and struggling to repay the debt. The fallout also affected Mary. She had thought she would live with Derek in the luxurious house, but when her son demolished the house of wealthy landowner Keith Jackson, she instantly became a target of ridicule. Naturally, she could not accept such a situation, and soon she found it difficult to leave her house. As for Keith, although his house was demolished, he hadn't suffered too much damage. The reason he had gone on an overseas trip was his daughter who lived abroad. He had received an international call from his son-in-law, saying that his daughter was about to give birth. Having lost his wife 20 years ago, Keith doted on his grandchild and decided to live abroad with his daughter, as she had previously consulted with him. So he intended to demolish the house and sell the land after selling his business. Of course, he was shocked because the house had disappeared sooner than expected, but he laughed, saying that the result was the same. I didn't inform my parents of anything until they returned from their San Francisco trip, because I didn't want to ruin their vacation. When they returned home and heard the whole story, they turned pale and were speechless. But they were relieved that nothing had happened to me. At my parents' suggestion, Keith stayed at our house until his business was settled. I also moved back to my parents' house from the weekly apartment, and we spent our time reminiscing about our memories with them, who would soon be unable to return to the U.S. for a while. About a month later, the day of Keith's departure finally arrived, and our family went to the airport to see him off. He was carrying a bunch of toys, and he seemed so excited to see his grandchild that he looked like he might start dancing. Although it was a time for goodbyes, his happiness was so infectious that we couldn't help but smile. We waved our hands as we watched him head towards the boarding gate. A few months later, we received several airmail letters from Keith, each containing photos. In every photo, he was holding his granddaughter, looking incredibly happy. My sister said, "They've been nagging us. They want to see their grandchild's face. It's definitely Keith's influence." I agreed. My sister and I had begun to hear our parents expressing their desire for a grandchild as well. Seeing Keith's happy face and the adorable photos of his granddaughter made me want to have a family of my own. But next time I get married, I vow to choose someone who isn't a mama's boy and who will genuinely cherish my family. Hi, I'm Astrid, and I'm 34 years old. I spend my days taking care of our home and our 2 daughters. My husband, Ben, and I got married 7 years ago, and since then, we've built a family of 4. Our daughters, Maya and Nilly, bring a lot of joy into our lives. Ben works hard and often gets home late, but he's a good provider for us, and I do my best to support him. Overall, our family life is pretty peaceful, but there's one big problem. My mother-in-law, Francine, she's what you might call a classic difficult mother-in-law. From the start of our marriage, she's made it clear she doesn't approve of me. She often criticizes my cooking, saying it needs more salt or broth. But I disagree. Adding more doesn't improve the taste, it just masks the flavor of the ingredients. But she didn't seem to care about my preferences at all. She'd add mayonnaise, sugar, salt, and whatever else she fancied into my dishes as if it were normal. If I cooked everything to her taste, it would be overpowering and I wouldn't enjoy it. This became a common occurrence whenever we visited my in-laws. From the very start of our marriage, she'd pester me about getting pregnant, almost like a broken record. Are you pregnant yet? When will I have a grandchild? She stopped asking after our first daughter was born, but after our second child, she started up again, this time with something even worse. She'd say things like, "Still no boy. When are you going to have your 3rd child? If you don't give birth to a boy, you're worthless as my eldest son's wife. You're a useless wife if you can't give me a grandson." It was relentless and hurtful. I had finally reached my breaking point with Francine's hurtful comments. No matter what she said, she always ended it with, "If you don't give birth to a boy, your existence is just pointless." It was infuriating. I mean, how pathetic can you be to judge someone's worth based on the gender of their children? I have 2 wonderful daughters, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I couldn't understand why Francine would say such terrible things to me. In what kind of backward thinking does she live, insisting that a baby had to be a boy? Children are precious regardless of their gender. These thoughts kept gnawing at me until I couldn't take it anymore. I finally opened up to my husband about the bullying. "I don't want to go to your parents' house anymore," I told him. To my relief, he understood. "Okay, you don't have to visit them anymore," he said. "But you should show up at least on Thanksgiving and New Year's." I agreed, though I really dreaded seeing Francine on those occasions. But as the eldest son, my husband felt obligated to attend, and I didn't want to make things harder for him. With this arrangement, I managed to minimize my interactions with my in-laws as much as possible. After some time, my husband started coming home much later than usual. Normally, he'd be back around 8 p.m. due to his work commitments, but recently it's been closer to 10 p.m. He claims it's because of overtime and work-related socializing. But I can't shake the feeling that something else might be going on. His late nights mean that my daughters hardly get to see him anymore. "Daddy's not coming home today either," they'd sadly remark. He says he's busy at work. It's heartbreaking to see them miss their father so much. That's why I finally decided to address the issue with my husband. One day, I mustered up the courage to ask my husband if he could come home early, even if just for a little while, because our daughters missed him dearly. But instead of understanding, he responded with irritation. "Who do you think I've been working this late for?" he snapped. "I'm not playing around. You've been too easy on yourself lately, haven't you? Even telling me about your issues with Mom." I was taken aback by his anger. All I wanted was for him to spend time with our daughters. Why did he have to react like this? Gradually, a divide started growing between us. Then, during Thanksgiving, I had to face Francine again, and she was as cruel as ever. Not only did she pick on me, but she also belittled her other daughter-in-laws, Lorna and Callie. She'd order us around, saying, "You all better get in the kitchen and start getting ready." And when she addressed my daughters, it was with dismissiveness, while showering her second son's son, Timmy, with praise. "Ha, Timmy, come over here." She'd say, "You're very important to me since you'll be our heir." It was clear discrimination. She treated Timmy as special because he was the grandson she wanted. while ignoring and marginalizing my daughters and the other daughter-in-laws. We formed a silent alliance, Lorna, Callie, and I, bonded by Francine's harassment. It's astonishing how Francine can switch her attitude so abruptly. I never imagined she presumed to decide that Timmy would be the heir without consulting me. It's beyond disrespectful. And you're right, it's not just Francine's behavior that's troubling. Our own husbands seem completely oblivious to the way their wives are being mistreated. They're off drinking and socializing while we're left to deal with the pressure from Francine. To make matters worse, Francine talks behind our backs to her relatives, spreading hurtful rumors and making outrageous comments like, "She really is a bad wife who can't get pregnant with a boy." It's appalling. Lorna, Callie, and I found solace in each other. We realized we were all going through similar struggles, and we leaned on each other for support. We promised to stand by one another, no matter what challenges came our way. As the months flew by, New Year's Day arrived, and Francine continued to boss us around, treating us like her servants. She'd rush us to bring out dishes and refill drinks promptly. Then she'd swoop in, holding my son, gushing about how adorable he was, and allowing all the relatives to hold him too. But things took a nasty turn when Francine, perhaps fueled by alcohol, started spewing hurtful comments loudly. "Why don't you leave your wife and get a new one then?" she exclaimed. Shockingly, my husband agreed, saying, "You're right, Mom. Maybe I don't need a wife like her." Their laughter echoed, joined by the other relatives, while we wives stood there in disbelief, feeling the weight of their cruelty. Then Francine went too far. She shoved divorce papers in my face, saying, "You should sign this already. I don't want you in this house anymore, and I don't want your granddaughters either. So you take them." It was a moment of utter betrayal and heartbreak. My husband stood there with a smirk on his face as Francine handed me the divorce papers. Feeling like I couldn't endure their cruelty any longer, I agreed to sign. To my surprise, my husband and I both completed the paperwork, and the divorce was finalized right there at the New Year's gathering. "Now I'll be able to live peacefully without any more hassle from you," Francine remarked, laughing alongside my husband. Feeling utterly alone, I decided to leave first. But before I could, Lorna and Callie rushed to my side, asking if I was okay. "I'm fine now," I assured them. "I'm leaving, but you two should find a way to escape too." As we exchanged these words, my sister-in-law Winona, who usually left early, suddenly spoke up. "I'm so happy for you, Astrid, that you got to divorce my terrible brother," she exclaimed. My husband's face turned pale. "How dare you say that to your own older brother?" he protested. But Winona wasn't backing down. "Shut up, you filthy cheater. I know everything. I know you're having an affair, Ben." The room fell silent, everyone frozen by Winona's accusation. My husband stammered, trying to deny it, but Winona was adamant. "We know," she insisted. "Don't embarrass your brother by denying it." The truth was out, and there was no going back. With a triumphant air, Winona presented incriminating photos of Ben with another woman to each relative's seat, shocking everyone in the room. "How did you even?" Ben stuttered, clearly caught off guard. "You're having an affair with a classmate of mine from high school," Winona revealed. "Another classmate saw you together and took these photos for me. Now you can't get away with this. With the divorce finalized, you must pay alimony and child support to Astrid, okay?" Ben vehemently denied it, but Winona's evidence was undeniable. Thanks to her unexpected intervention, I was granted a divorce, all because of Ben and his reckless actions. "Now is the time for you both to decide," Winona urged Lorna and Callie. "Even if Astrid gets divorced first like this, Mom will keep pressuring you both." Encouraged by Winona's courage, Lorna and Callie confronted their husbands. "I hate that our child was made heir without my consent," Lorna explained. "And I hate that you agreed with your mother. I won't tolerate being controlled by her anymore. Let's get a divorce." "What divorce?" Callie's husband retorted. "If you don't like it, then cut ties with your family. If not, I'm taking Timmy with me, and you'll never see him again." Shocked by the ultimatum, Callie stood her ground. I refuse to be bullied by your mother any longer. Either divorce me and stay with your family, or cut ties with them. You choose." The room fell silent, tension thick in the air as each couple faced an impossible decision. Amidst the unexpected chaos, the relatives hastily excused themselves, apologizing for the disturbance before swiftly departing. But Francine remained incensed by the upheaval. "What do you think you're both doing? I'll never allow you to get a divorce," she declared vehemently. "It's not up to you, Mom. It's their decision," then interjected firmly. Determined to break free from the toxic influence, I added, "And I'll cut ties with your family too. That's why I came here today." Feeling the weight of their wives' resolve, Lauren and Callie pressed their husbands to make a choice. Eventually, Ned and Steve, feeling the pressure, decided to sever ties with the family. Ned couldn't stand the thought of being separated from his son. But Steve made the difficult decision to cut ties with his family because he loved his wife deeply. In the end, Francine was left with only Ben, who was drowning in debt. I received a substantial amount of alimony from my ex-husband and his lover, who refused to marry him, citing her existing marriage. Ben's reputation suffered both personally and professionally, and he became a laughingstock with no chance of remarriage. As for Francine, the neighborhood gossip painted her as abandoned by her sons, a fate she seemingly brought upon herself. Seeing their downfall brought me immense satisfaction. I moved to the city, where my aunt offered me a job, and I started a new life there with my daughters. Winona, who also lived in the city, became a close confidant. We often met for drinks and arranged playdates for our children. For now, I decided to focus on work and providing for my daughters. Love can wait, but my daughter's well-being cannot. My name is Mia Yates. I'm 23 years old, and I work from home. I have an older brother who's 5 years older than me, and he's currently engaged to Natalie, who's 26. Natalie's quite different from me. She's outgoing and easily makes friends, while I'm not so great at socializing. Natalie's become close to our parents and often visits us without giving a heads up. Today was no exception. When she arrived, my mom welcomed her warmly. Natalie walked in, greeted my mom, and then noticed me with a puzzled expression. "You're still at home, Maya," she said without even saying hello. "I'm working from home," I replied. "Enough with that. You need to get a job," she retorted. I couldn't argue, so I just went back to my workspace. My room is like my sanctuary. It's soundproof, and I designed it myself, paying for all the modifications. I keep it locked, not letting anyone in. To enter, you have to unlock the soundproof door and then open another door inside. Feeling frustrated, I vented in my room, shouting until I felt better. Around lunchtime, the light bulb in my room blinked, signaling it's time to eat. I headed to the living room where lunch was ready. My mom suggested we eat together, so I sat down, but Natalie looked displeased. "You get hungry even though you don't work. Ever think about helping out?" she said, calling me a parasite. I stayed quiet, listening to her complaints. When my parents started eating, I joined in. Natalie wasn't happy that my parents didn't scold me for not working. "You two are too lenient with Mia. I can't marry into a family like this," she said angrily. My parents reassured her, but she kept expressing her concerns, assuming I'd always depend on others. Feeling hurt, I stopped eating and kept my head down. My mom tried to reassure Natalie, saying I do work, but Natalie seemed unconvinced. Natalie wouldn't let up. She looked at me, noting my appearance with my hair braided, thick glasses, and always wearing sweats. She couldn't believe I was actually working, looking like that. Frustrated, I tried to explain softly that appearance doesn't dictate one's work, but this only seemed to make her angrier. "What kind of job do you do then? Say it," she demanded, glaring at me. I was too scared to respond. It was my mother who stepped in, saying that only our family knows about my job and we couldn't discuss it right then. Hearing this, Natalie stood up and stormed off, questioning if she even belonged in our family. I felt bad for causing a scene, but my father reassured me not to worry and encouraged me to do what I love. Feeling relieved, I continued with dinner. Over the meal, I suggested that after my brother's wedding, I would tell Natalie about my job. My parents seemed to agree that it might be a good idea. After lunch, I got back to work. In the evening, I went grocery shopping with my mom while my dad tended to the garden. When we returned, we found Natalie in tears with my father comforting her. Concerned, my mom asked Natalie what was wrong. She couldn't speak, just sobbed harder. Seeing my father's troubled expression, I asked him what happened. He heard a loud noise from inside the house while he was in the garden and rushed to investigate. He pointed to a crowbar and hammer on the table. I instantly realized it was my room and ran towards it. The door was badly damaged, as if someone had tried to force it open. I was frozen with shock and fear. My father contacted my brother, who lived in a company dorm, and he promised to rush over after work. I decided to stay in my room until he arrived, trying to calm down. Once settled, I called my company and got permission to inform Natalie about my job after her marriage to my brother. When the room light flickered, I assumed my brother had arrived. When I left my room, I was surprised to see him already at the door. Apologizing for startling me, he said he would replace the damaged door himself. But I insisted that Natalie should compensate for it. Taking my hand, my brother led me to the living room where Natalie and my parents were. He addressed Natalie, expressing his shock at her actions, and demanded she apologize properly and compensate for the door. Natalie tearfully apologized to my brother, but he made it clear that the apology was for me, not him. Despite me saying it was okay, my brother continued to glare at Natalie. She then turned to me, knelt down, and apologized. Accepting her apology, I decided to move past the incident, but I wanted to understand why she did it. When I asked, Natalie explained that she thought if I didn't have a place to hide, I would be forced to work. Her words troubled me, making me wonder if I should tell her about my job before the wedding. However, revealing the nature of my job would go against company policy, so I chose to keep quiet about it for the time being. The tense atmosphere between my brother and Natalie bothered me, so I decided to lighten the mood by bringing out 2 live concert tickets from my room and giving one to each of them. Natalie was thrilled when she saw the tickets were for an Ames concert and turned bright red with excitement. She eagerly suggested to my brother that they go together. My brother was surprised, knowing how hard it is to get these tickets, but I assured him that I happened to acquire them and they could use them as a peace offering if they wanted. Both Natalie and my brother looked delighted, and seeing them happy made me feel joyful too. The good vibes returned, and everyone was able to forget about the damaged door and enjoy their meal. On the day of the concert, while I was out, Natalie excitedly visited my house to express her gratitude to me. Since I wasn't home, she told my parents, "Enjoy." Finally, Mia has decided to work outside and seemed genuinely happy about it. After the concert, my brother called me, thrilled about how great it was. He mentioned that Natalie is actually a huge fan of Ames and had always wanted to secure the once-in-a-year concert tickets. She was extremely excited to fulfill this long-time wish at the concert. On the way home, Natalie seemed elated, describing the experience as adorable, beautiful, and praising the songs and lyrics. When I mentioned I was glad we made up, my brother told me the soundproof door we paid for as compensation cost $7,000, to which I casually responded that it sounded about right. He was surprised at the expense, but I explained that since it was a soundproof room, all the components were pricey, which astonished him even more. Natalie was said to have mentioned that the expense hurt, but the concert made up for it. As for me, knowing my brother and his friends were getting along well made me feel really good about giving them the tickets. Natalie, still not understanding my work-from-home job, mistakenly thought I started working outside after the concert and was pleased. When she realized her mistake, she began calling and visiting my house daily, urging me to get a job before the wedding. I hoped to endure it until the ceremony, but things only escalated. Even if I didn't want to see her until then, Natalie frequently summoned me from my room to the living room, where she nagged me about getting a job before the wedding and not wanting a jobless NEET in the family. To distract her, I gave her merchandise like mascots and file cases I received from my previous company. Initially, she accepted her favorite AIM goods without question, but eventually, she started to wonder why I had so much AIM merchandise. Reluctantly, I told her a friend who works with AIM company gives them to me. Hearing this, she smiled and asked for more tickets next time. However, she continued to demand more merchandise and started causing trouble by insisting on being allowed into my room. I managed to stop her a few times, but I was worried she might break the door again. So I mustered up the courage to give her a stern warning, saying if she broke the door again, she would be the one paying for it this time. Natalie's face turned pale upon hearing this, making me wonder if she really was planning to do it again. All I could do was hope the wedding ceremony would be over soon so I could be free. Even then, until the wedding day, there was never a day when Natalie visited or the call light didn't flash. I lost count of how many times I shouted, "Enough already," in my room. I tried talking to my brother about it, but he seemed resigned, saying he'd told Natalie countless times that I was working. But she didn't seem to listen. I wished he'd get angry like when she broke my door, but he was busy with wedding preparations. Finally, the day before the wedding arrived, and it seemed our parents would spend the day together. So we had a fun night reminiscing and looking at old photo albums. I mentioned that when I get married, my brother would have his own family, so it would just be the three of us with our parents. On the day before the wedding, my brother assured me he'd spend the day alone with our parents, which I appreciated. In that calm moment, his phone rang, and it was Natalie calling. When he handed me the phone, she asked about a major announcement from AIM, but I wanted to enjoy my family time and didn't want to be bothered, so I brushed it off. My brother seemed to feel the same and turned off his phone. As our father reminded us to get up early, my brother bowed deeply and thanked our parents for taking care of him. Mom jokingly remarked that's what women do when they get married, which led to laughter, ending the night on a light note. Finally, the wedding day arrived. I informed my family that I'd be a little late in the morning, and they went ahead to the venue. When I arrived later, I went to the waiting room to congratulate Natalie. However, instead of the beautiful bride, I was met with a hostile demeanor. She accused me of ignoring her call about the AIM announcement and demanded to know why I hadn't gotten a job despite her repeated requests. She made it clear she didn't want people to think I was part of the family. When I tried to explain, she shut me down, insisting I leave. Feeling dejected, I retreated to a separate room reserved for me. There, I had my makeup and hair done by professionals and changed into the cocktail dress I'd bought for the wedding. Preparing for my brother's wedding, which I wouldn't be attending, was a bittersweet experience. Amidst the preparations, I received a call from my parents. I assured them that even though I wouldn't be physically present at the ceremony, I still intended to celebrate. As the wedding ceremony began without me, I decided to watch it on the venue's monitor to feel connected to the event. There was a moment when my brother looked around for me, and it nearly brought me to tears. However, I reminded myself that it was a day for celebration, not sorrow, and continued to watch and bless the occasion. After the entertainment segment, the female MC announced a special celebration video for the newlyweds. As the room darkened, a video started playing on the monitor. The image on the screen was of AIM, whom Natalie adored, delivering a congratulatory message. In a surprising twist, AIM revealed that she was actually me, Nia, congratulating my brother and Natalie on their marriage. Natalie looked stunned, and my brother seemed to realize the truth. I apologized for not disclosing my identity earlier and explained that I was leaving for overseas work, likely never to see them again. I urged Natalie to pretend we weren't family, ending my message with well wishes for their happiness. As the lights came back on, all eyes were on Natalie, who looked visibly shaken. Later, my brother informed me that after we left, Natalie broke down crying, regretting her actions. Apparently, she was now known as the bride who wasn't considered family by AIM, and my speech had gone viral on social media. I heard she couldn't even face her neighbors anymore due to the embarrassment.
My mom's friend always seems to find an excuse not to pay for the meals she invites me to. She'll suggest we go out, but then she leaves without paying, acting like it's no big deal. Over time, I've ended up being the one who always forks out the money. One day, she invited me to stay at a hotel, and then casually dropped the bomb that I needed to pay $1,500. I was totally baffled and asked her what on earth she was talking about. She insisted that I foot the bill for our lodging. It was such an unreasonable demand that I'm still in shock, but I've decided it's time to set things straight and make her face reality. My name is Michelle, I'm 45 years old, and I work in an office. I live with my husband of 18 years, along with our daughter who's in middle school and our son who's in elementary school. Since both my husband and I have jobs, we split the household chores. We help each other out. Whoever has some free time does the dishes, and we work together to manage our daily routines. My husband is really involved with our kids, driving our daughter to her sports activities and playing catch with our son. He's an amazing father, and I'm grateful to have such a thoughtful husband and adorable children to spend time with. One day, someone disrupted my peaceful routine. While I was taking out the trash, my neighbor and fellow mom, Susan, approached me with an invitation for coffee. "Good morning. How about coffee sometime?" she asked cheerfully. I responded with a non-committal "Oh, coffee." She explained that there was a new cafe nearby known for its delicious Korean bread. Despite my hesitation, Susan seemed eager to go. Susan, a mom of my daughter's classmate, hadn't interacted with me much before, but we'd had some recent interactions. She suggested going on Saturday, noting that my daughter had sports and my son had plans with friends, so it wouldn't interfere with family time. I was surprised that she knew my children's schedules and asked how she knew. She casually mentioned hearing about it from David, who's in the same sports activities as my daughter, and that my son had mentioned his plans. Feeling somewhat cornered by Susan's good mood and her knowledge of my kids' schedules, I reluctantly agreed to Saturday. She left after setting the date and meeting place, and I found myself committed to going to the cafe. When Saturday arrived, I wasn't feeling great after working overtime, but we had plans to meet at the station. Susan was nowhere to be seen even 10 minutes later, but then I spotted her waving from a distance, looking cheerful. "Oh, it's a bit chilly today," she remarked, without offering any apology for being late. She chatted all the way from the station to the cafe. When we arrived, there was an unexpectedly long line, even though the cafe had only been open for an hour. "Oh my, lots of young people," Susan commented. Most of the other customers were indeed young. I suggested going to another place because of the long wait, but Susan stubbornly refused, saying, "No, I want to try this bread." We waited in line for an hour before finally being seated. Guided by the staff, I felt tired. "Michelle, you should have gotten the drinks ready," Susan said, holding back my frustration. I smiled and apologized. Sorry for not being more thoughtful. The bread at the cafe that Susan had strongly recommended turned out to be delicious, and I felt very satisfied. I even thought about coming back with my family next time. As we were getting ready to leave, Susan suddenly excused herself, saying she needed to use the restroom, and hurried off. After waiting for another 5 minutes and feeling the stares of people in the waiting line, I decided to pay the bill. Another 10 minutes passed before Susan finally emerged from the shop, apologizing for keeping me waiting and mentioning that her stomach had been hurting a little. I asked about her condition, and she assured me she was fine now, walking ahead of me. Just as I started to speak, Susan cut me off, asking if I was thirsty and insisting that I pick something to drink. Despite my attempts to decline, she pushed me to choose, and I ended up picking some tea. "It's on me, enjoy your drink," she said, sounding smug. I thanked her, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was trying to cover the cost of the coffee and bread. I didn't feel comfortable explicitly asking her to pay, as it seemed awkward. Normally, wouldn't you ask the person how much it was? Feeling a bit uneasy, we arrived at the station before I realized it. Susan quickly said she had something to do and headed home. Since then, every time I was invited for tea by Susan, she would conveniently ditch the bill. Not only that, but she seemed to be gathering information about my family's activities from other people. Meanwhile, she would leave her kids with her in-laws on weekends and go out with friends, rarely being at home. Lately, she had even started leaving her kids with us to go out drinking on weekday nights. She would check when we would be home, bringing her child over before dinner, casually saying, "Oh, is it near dinner time? Well then, please take care of my child too." The child seemed happy to eat with us, feeling like siblings, but it wasn't the same for us adults. One time, I asked if her husband was home, to which she replied that he was often on business trips, so he wasn't there at the moment. "Take care, okay," she said as she left. It seemed her husband's absence was frequent due to work. "Hold on, I thought at least pay for the food, please." Honestly, with 2 grown children, the cost of food could be quite a burden. "It doesn't make much difference with just 2 more," Susan said before leaving, but any homemaker should understand that. A month had passed since we started living this way and the kids were on summer vacation. On the way home, Susan from the neighborhood invited us to go out with our families. What should we do? On his way home from work, my husband had been approached by Susan. Since Susan's husband would be home, she invited us to go out during the holiday. If it's with the family, it's probably fine. If her husband is there, it shouldn't be a problem, right? With some apprehension, I considered the situation. "I don't know, but the kids seem to be on board," my husband remarked. Apparently, he had already discussed it with them, and they were excited. "It depends on you and my schedule," he added. I was dumbfounded by Susan's strong-arm tactics and couldn't find the words to object. "If the kids are looking forward to it, we have no choice," I reluctantly agreed. I contacted Susan and we arranged the time and place. Finally, the day arrived. As we gathered, I couldn't help but notice Susan's husband was missing. Unfortunately, he had to leave on a sudden business trip. It seems Susan's family wouldn't be joining us, just her and her 2 children. We decided to follow behind in separate cars, arriving at the rental campground with fully equipped facilities, including cottages. We prepared for an overnight stay. While setting up the barbecue, the kids were already playing. Once everything was ready, we started grilling the meat. We had reserved food for 10, expecting Susan's family to join. Since her husband wasn't there, we had 3 extra servings. I worried we might have too much. Breakfast is always a favorite for the kids during the summer break, but planning lunch and dinner can be a hassle. We chatted casually while Susan just sat there. "That's why today we're just grilling meat, easy peasy," I remarked as my husband and I busily prepared and grilled the meat. As Susan sits there with a cool expression on her face, she comments, "We have to watch the kids properly after all." But she only observes them from afar. When I call the children to eat the grilled meat, she reaches out and takes it, exclaiming, "Wow, that looks delicious." My children and I are surprised, and Susan suddenly realizes her mistake, saying, "Oh, is this for the children? I was thinking of giving it to them first, but it's fine since we're grilling more." The children look disappointed, but Susan just laughs it off, saying, "You better eat quickly or I'll eat it all up." My husband and the kids are taken aback by her behavior. Susan proceeds to eat even more meat than the growing children. We had planned 1 lamb chop per person, but she has already had 4 and is reaching for more. "Susan, you've reserved only 1 lamb chop per person. You've already eaten 2 extra ones for yourself and your husband, so please eat something else," I tell her, hoping she'll understand. It might seem like a trivial matter, but there's no substitute food because it's by reservation. "What? There are restrictions on what I can eat? That's stingy," Susan complained. I replied, "Didn't you check when you made the reservation?" She should have known exactly what and how much was available since we decided on it together during planning. Had we talked about ordering more because we have growing children? Susan insisted, "I don't eat much, I have a small appetite. Just think of me as not there, and 1 extra portion should be fine with my children who eat well and the men around." I thought it would be safe to order for 10 people. We had 2 middle school children who could eat 2 portions each and 1 elementary school child who could eat 2 portions, so there shouldn't have been any problem with the amount. However, the meat was disappearing quickly. "Mom, I want to eat that meat," my son said, reaching for it, only to have Susan snatch it and eat it quickly. I was angry, but my usually mild-mannered husband was starting to show his irritation as well. The reason we couldn't strongly object was that Susan's children were also there. "Mom, don't act like a child," said Susan's daughter. "What are you talking about? Camping is all about survival, and survival means fighting over meat." The children seemed dumbfounded by Susan's childish behavior. Afterward, we finished the barbecue, played outside for a while, and then decided to take a break. The cottages were separate, so we could get away from Susan and catch our breath. It was supposed to be fun, but the tension was palpable. My husband looked tired, and I agreed, suggesting we eat breakfast and head home early the next day. We spent the rest of the time relaxing with the family and greeted the morning. "Good morning." Susan came out of her cottage cheerfully. "You're lively this morning," I replied. "Of course, I ate a lot and relaxed." "I had a great time," she said. For breakfast, we ate the provided sandwiches, played a little more, and then started preparing to leave. During the final payment, Susan was nowhere to be found. "Susan's not here," I told my husband, and we looked around, but her children were also missing. "Hey, where's Susan and her kids?" I asked the children if they had seen her, and they said they were going to the restroom. As we waited for Susan to return and settle the payment, I asked the cashier to wait a little longer. After waiting for another 10 minutes, Susan still hadn't returned. "Isn't this taking too long?" my husband asked, looking concerned. I decided to check the restroom, but Susan and her children were nowhere to be found. Furthermore, her car, which should have been parked nearby, was gone too. I couldn't believe it. I felt a surge of anger building up inside me. How could she invite us and then run away without paying? It was infuriating. The total cost of the camping equipment, cottage accommodation, drinks, meat, and everything else came close to $900. Susan had confirmed the approximate amount at the time of reservation, and she had been the one who chose the place. She had rejected all the places I suggested and insisted that this particular place was perfect. Choosing a location that only allowed on-site payment now seemed like a premeditated act. We decided to head straight to Susan's house. "Susan, please open up." I rang the doorbell several times until Susan reluctantly opened the door. "Susan, why did you leave without saying anything?" I questioned, feeling frustrated. "Huh? Didn't I say I was leaving?" She pretended not to know. "Susan, you have to pay on the spot. Hand over the money," I told her, a bit forcefully. "Oh, I forgot, but I don't have any money right now," Susan replied, appearing indifferent to the situation. "We confirmed the amount in advance, didn't we?" "You were the one who set the budget, Susan." I finally spoke up, unable to keep quiet any longer. Susan kept insisting she had no money, so I asked her what was going on. "I bought something I wanted before the camping trip. Look," she said, laughing and showing off her recent purchase. "So you didn't have any money during the camping trip?" I asked, getting irritated. But Susan continued to laugh without feeling sorry at all. "Yeah, I didn't have it when I reserved, so what?" she replied casually. I was fed up with Susan, who seemed to have planned this from the beginning. "You planned this from the beginning," I accused her. "Well, thanks to me inviting you, we had a great time. It's a win-win situation, isn't it?" Susan retorted, showing no remorse. I confirmed one last time. "So you have no intention of paying?" Susan brushed off my persistence, saying, "It's embarrassing how persistent you are. I told you I don't have the money. When I get it, I'll pay you back. Or are you trying to squeeze money out of someone who doesn't have any?" With no shame and an unapologetic attitude, Susan laughed, and I reached my breaking point. "I see, understood," I said, deciding to go home without saying anything more. I discussed the situation with my husband, and time passed. Susan suggested going to a tasty restaurant nearby, acting as if the past incident never happened. "I'm sorry, I'm busy, so I'll have to pass," I replied, turning down Susan's invitations for the past few months, losing patience. Susan approached me with an angry look, asking, "Hey, are you avoiding me? You're still holding a grudge over the camping thing. A few hundred or a few $1,000s, so what? I can't believe you'd avoid someone over that, even if it were several tens of thousands." Susan ranted, infuriated and talking fast. "That's so, Susan. Let's go to an inn next time," I suggested, trying to diffuse the tension. "Huh? Oh sure, you planned it. In that case, I'll have to coordinate with my family," Susan replied, becoming cheerful. I told her my husband had given me some alone time and was thinking of going on a 2-night trip. When she asked if my husband would mind taking care of the kids, I declined, saying he was busy. To the hesitant Susan, I said, "I plan to stay for 2 nights from Friday. If it's difficult, I'll go alone." Susan suggested leaving her kids with her husband's parents and joining me on the trip. When I showed Susan the exterior of the inn, she became even more delighted. "I'll book 2 rooms. There seems to be a spot in all," I informed her. Excitedly, Susan started looking up various things on her own. "How about I invite my friends too?" she suggested, so I agreed to make all the reservations at once. A month later, the day of the inn reservation arrived. Susan and her friends were at my house, looking puzzled at me. "Aren't you going to drive us?" Susan asked. Sorry, I have to stop by my in-laws, so let's go separately, I said. Susan reluctantly agreed, and we headed to the inn in different cars. Wow, I can't believe we're staying at such a lovely inn, Michelle. Thank you, everyone exclaimed, amazed at the magnificence of the inn. Let's enjoy our free time then, I suggested. Susan and her friends seemed to be having a great time, seemingly forgetting about me. The first day was filled with eating, bathing, and sleeping. After the bath, I ran into Susan and her friends having a huddled conversation. Hey Susan, are you sure about staying at such an expensive inn? Can you afford it? One of Susan's friends asked. Yes, it's all on me, Susan boasted. Amazing. It's over $1,000 per person per night. So generous. Another friend exclaimed. In that case, I'll turn off notifications for texts and calls and spend time in his dream world until we leave the hotel, Susan declared. Susan said she would pay for her 5 friends lodging in full, and everyone was getting excited. The morning of the second day, they went to the spa for massages and were able to spend meaningful time healing their everyday fatigue. I tried texting Susan, but she didn't read or reply to my messages. Even by nightfall, there was no response. Hello, Michelle, it's morning already. Cheerful Susan called out. Yes, that's right, I replied, wondering why I was stating the obvious. You overslept, so it's your fault, right? We're going home first, so pay $155,000, Susan said, catching me off guard. Huh? Overslept? $155,000? What are you talking about? I didn't understand her sudden demand. The last one always pays, right? Susan insisted. Yeah, I'm already home though. Didn't you see my text? I had informed Susan via text that I was going home. Oh, I wouldn't be looking at my phone in such a fabulous, unreal place, Susan explained. I clarified the situation, telling her I went home on a second night because my mother-in-law wasn't feeling well. Originally, I was only going to pick up the children and husband who were out playing, but I decided to leave early. Why didn't you say something? Susan was angry. I explained that my husband contacted me late, so I texted her. She then asked, "What about the bill?" Thinking she was mad about me going home without paying my share, I reassured her, saying, "Don't worry, I've already paid." "Oh right, that's fine then. We just have to return the keys at the front desk and go home," Susan said, her tone returning to calm. "Well, yes, since it's on-site payment, please stop by the front desk. My part has been properly deducted. If the front desk handled everything properly, there shouldn't be a problem," I explained. "You didn't pay, right?" Susan asked again. "Yes, I paid my part before I left, so it's okay," I replied, hoping to clear up any misunderstanding. However, Susan's next words made me uneasy. "What about our part?" With this question, I was sure that Susan intended to make me pay. "Please pay for yourselves," I heard. After the bath, I reminded Susan, "You were going to pay for your friends, right?" "Ah, well, Susan stammered. "You were amazing. Honestly, I thought you were the worst kind of person for always disappearing when it's time to pay. So you really were going to pay back the money for the camp later." "I misunderstood you, Susan. I'm sorry," I joked, trying to ease the tension. "Wait a minute." I cut off Susan's protest and continued, "Tell me all about your wonderful time when you get back. See you later," and I hung up the phone. When I got home, my worried husband asked, "Are you okay?" But I smiled and said, "Yeah, I'm fine." Later, Susan, who had invited her friends by saying she would pay, somehow managed to settle the bill using multiple credit cards. When Susan returned, her complexion was very bad, unlike the last time I saw her at the inn. I never intended to pay, she screamed as she went home. According to what the children heard from Susan's children, her husband, who had returned from a business trip, scolded her terribly. "You have to earn and pay that large amount of $155,000 yourself," he said. Susan seemed to have started working part-time. For someone who had been leading a sloppy life, leaving housework and childcare to others, it must be a very tough time. She seems to be working so hard that she has no time to rest, both physically and mentally. I no longer receive invitations to play from Susan, nor do I have to look after her children. I've been able to regain a peaceful daily life. On holidays, I can spend time leisurely with my family, and I'm very happy.
I'm truly sorry that Emma the groom's younger sister, is part of our family. To be frank, someone like Emma, who only finished middle school, doesn't reflect well on us. In my opinion, she should avoid family gatherings and be careful about her social standing when she's around us. During the family representative's speech at the wedding reception, the bride's father, his face turning red, shocked us all with his unpleasant words. We were completely caught off guard by his statement, and we were speechless, mouths hanging open. Suddenly, Nate the groom stood up and approached the bride's father with a gentle smile on his face. From our family's perspective, Nate's expression seemed to show anger. When my brother raised his arm towards the bride's father, I quickly stood up to intervene. My name is Emma Brown, and I work at a well-known construction company in the area. Initially, it was tough for me to fit into the mostly male environment, but over time, I've developed good working relationships with the carpenters there. The foreman is still strict and intimidating, but I respect him because he's passionate about passing on his skills to younger workers. After everyone left the construction site, I took a moment to relax and reflect on recent events. Then, I got back to work, silently drawing up blueprints for the next task. By the time I finished, it was already evening, and I realized I hadn't taken a break since lunch. My stomach growled loudly, reminding me to eat. After reviewing the blueprints one last time and giving them my approval, I began tidying up to head back to the apartment provided by the company. That's when I noticed sandwiches on the desk in the rest area, along with a note from the foreman encouraging me to eat. It warmed my heart, and I couldn't help but smile as I gratefully accepted the sandwiches. After securing the premises, I returned to the apartment, and suddenly my smartphone rang. Thinking it might be someone else, I glanced at the screen and was surprised to see my brother's name. We hadn't spoken in years. Unlike me, he's always been exceptionally talented. Despite being a bit laid back at times, he dedicated himself to his studies, graduated from medical school, and now works as a surgeon at the largest hospital in our hometown. Feeling a bit nervous, I placed the sandwiches on the desk and took a deep breath before answering. When I heard my brother's voice, saying he was glad I picked up, my nerves heightened. In a trembling voice, I asked what was going on all of a sudden. He explained, somewhat embarrassed, that he decided to marry his current partner. He knew I might be busy, but he really wanted me at the wedding. We hadn't seen each other in so long, and he'd been thinking about it. It seemed like a good opportunity. He asked what I thought. In a slightly nervous tone, I replied, "Of course." He smiled with great joy, warming my heart. After briefly catching up on our lives, we reluctantly hung up the phone, suppressing the feeling of nostalgia. I don't know much about his partner, but I assume he's already introduced them to our parents. I'll probably have a conversation with them about it before the wedding day. As I idly pondered these thoughts, I couldn't help but feel happy. I decided to warm up the sandwiches the foreman had given me in the microwave and enjoyed my meal. They seemed to taste even better than usual that day. A while later, I received the wedding invitation from my brother. Once the date was confirmed, I talked to the foreman about taking some time off. After a brief pause, he gave me his consent. Relieved by his response, he chuckled and mentioned a condition. There was a request for me to take on the role of a guest lecturer for just 3 days at a specialized construction school run by an acquaintance. I hesitated about my ability to handle the task, but the foreman reassured me. His words gave me determination, and I nodded firmly. As promised, I arrived at the address provided by the foreman. On the designated day and time, I stood in front of a stunning building, surprised to find out it was the entire campus of the specialized construction school. With awe, I entered the building and nervously spoke to the receptionist. They directed me to a preparation room set up for guest lecturers, where I was reviewing my lecture content when there was a knock on the door. A man entered, and I greeted him with a puzzled expression, introducing myself as Emma from the construction company. He stared at me, seeming to assess me, then let out a deep sigh. He remarked that even though it's a prestigious specialized school, it's difficult for him to share his skills easily. We discussed the importance of tradition, yet he expressed disbelief at the idea of allowing a woman in. Despite his words, he urged me to do my best this time. Frustrated by his dismissive comments about women, I met his intense stare and spoke up, emphasizing that gender doesn't determine success in any industry. I asserted that good work is achieved when individual personalities come together, and making such dismissive comments about women only hinders progress. Working in a specialized construction school with such rigid prejudices is unacceptable. This perpetuates the stagnant state of our world. Please, let's not burden the young minds about to enter the architectural world with these outdated biases. Furthermore, I won't approach this as a casual 3-day task. I promise to make those days meaningful for the students. Upon hearing my determination, the man let out a frustrated sigh, seemingly annoyed by confident women who succeeded in male-dominated fields. He walked away, but I stared after him, resolved to deliver a lecture that would inspire the students. With burning passion, I stepped into the classroom and successfully completed my 3-day stint as a guest lecturer. I left the specialized school with warm farewells from the students I connected with. Returning to the construction company, I informed the foreman about the lectures I delivered and the disrespectful remarks made by the person in charge on the first day. After hearing my story, the foreman simply acknowledged the situation. There were no specific criticisms, which relieved me. Filled with joy, I skipped back to my apartment, eagerly awaiting my brother's wedding day, according to my parents who had gathered at a hotel near the venue. My brother's fiancée was named Amy White, a nurse at the same hospital as him. She not only cared for patients but also assisted doctors in the operating room. As I made my way to the dressing room at the wedding venue, I found the dress my mother had prepared. Seeing it, I burst into laughter. It was a fluttery dress, unlike anything I'd worn before. My skilled mother quickly took charge of my makeup and hairstyling. In no time, I found myself feeling too embarrassed to look in the mirror, my flushed cheeks cooling. Despite my reluctance, I couldn't help but feel a bit touched hearing compliments from my parents about how cute I looked. Afterward, I made my way to the family waiting room. However, my attention was captured by a particular man in the family waiting room. It was undoubtedly the person in charge of the specialized school who had ridiculed me on that day. With a friendly smile, this man named Kenny White approached us, and it became apparent that he was Amy's father. I did my best to conceal my discomfort, though I was taken aback by the unexpected reunion. I thought we would only have to deal with each other today and wouldn't have any reason to speak in the future. Remembering his words from that day, I suppressed my irritation and proceeded to greet him after my parents. However, he either didn't realize or chose to ignore my discomfort and commented, "You look like a lovely young lady." This remark only increased my irritation. Throughout the conversation, I mostly listened to my parents and avoided unnecessary interjections. However, Kenny seemed considerate and included me, asking about my university. Unable to ignore him, I replied with a forced smile, explaining that I graduated from middle school and started working for personal reasons. For a brief moment, Kenny's smiling face turned slightly distorted, and I felt like he gave me a cold stare. Observing his expression with a furrowed brow, trying not to be noticed, I saw him quickly return to a smile and say, "I see, that's interesting," before changing the subject. Although I felt a strange sense of unease due to that brief change in expression, I focused on my brother and Amy's beautiful wedding ceremony. Amy looked even more stunning than I had imagined in her pure white wedding dress, and my brother, dressed in a matching all-white tuxedo, looked incredibly dashing. Seeing them together made me smile warmly. As we transitioned to the reception, my father suddenly began to look flustered. When I asked him what was wrong, he explained that my brother had asked him to deliver the family's representative speech. As he wiped sweat from his brow and checked his notes, I exchanged glances with my mother and shared a wry smile. The speech from the bride's family representative began before my father's turn, and Kenny seemed to be in high spirits. Seeing his daughter in her bridal attire, Kenny seemed to have consumed quite a bit of alcohol, evident from his flushed face and unsteady demeanor. as he was supported by the bride's mother. Eventually, he made his way to the microphone, still somewhat drunk. As I watched Kenny confidently stand in front of the microphone, despite his inebriated state, I couldn't help but chuckle, noticing his different air of authority compared to my father. With the microphone in hand, Kenny bowed and began to speak, sporting a smirk on his face. He thanked everyone for gathering to celebrate his daughter's wedding, but then took an unexpected turn. He expressed his true feelings, apologizing for the connection between Emma, the groom's younger sister, and his outstanding family. Bluntly, he labeled Emma, who only graduated from middle school, as a disgrace to the family, suggesting she should stay away from family gatherings and be mindful of her social status when interacting with them. His sudden and shocking words left me, my father, and my mother utterly speechless. However, in the corner of my mind, Kenny's earlier expression came to mind, and I felt like I understood the reason behind it. A sense of frustration slowly welled up within me. Abruptly, my brother stood up and approached Kenny with a calm smile. It was clear from my brother's expression that he was upset, a sentiment evident to our family as well. As I saw my brother approaching Kenny and raising his arm, I stood up to intervene and stopped my brother. However, my brother maintained a fixed smile and only took the microphone from Kenny. Seeing this, I halted my movement, and my brother began speaking to Kenny. He expressed disbelief that someone who values connections with people, like Kenny, would be unaware of my sister's profession. To confirm, he asked if Kenny knew my sister's profession properly. Kenny, not understanding the meaning of the question, mumbled in confusion and froze in place. My brother continued, stating that Kenny had personally requested my sister as a lecturer at the specialized school and enjoyed visiting old architectural structures like churches. He revealed that Emma is a master carpenter involved in their restoration. Hearing this, Kenny started trembling and suddenly shouted angrily at my brother, claiming that a woman couldn't handle such a role as a master carpenter. As Kenny continued to make a scene, seemingly forgetting the other guests at the reception, my brother maintained his smile and spoke once more. He pointed out that Emma is a genuine master carpenter trained under the human national treasure, Mr. Herbert Smith. He challenged Kenny's notion that she couldn't handle it just because she's a woman, reminding him that he was the one who reached out to her in the first place. When my brother gestured towards someone, I looked in that direction and noticed the master carpenter sitting quietly in a less conspicuous corner. I was left speechless in astonishment. The foreman, who had been silent up to that point, grinned when he made eye contact with my brother and shot a piercing stare at Kenny. He pointed out that Kenny, being in a position to guide the young folks who will shape the future of the construction industry, harbored such twisted prejudices. He mentioned hearing about what was said when Emma went to teach at Kenny's school. But this is on a whole other level. Whether it's a woman or a man doesn't matter. It's about leveraging each person's strengths to cooperate and become the best we can be. If you keep insisting it's a man's world, you'll be left behind by the times. And by the way, I'm pretty sure I made myself clear during the discussion about the teaching assignment. I said the best apprentice for this task is available. You think I'm underestimating things. If anything, from where I stand, you're the one underestimating us. Intimidated by the thunderous voice echoing through the venue and the piercing gaze, Kenny's confidence seemed to evaporate. He turned pale and muttered an apology before returning to his seat in a daze. The venue remained agitated for a while, but then Amy stood up and, with a composed voice, said, "I apologize for the interruption. Let's take a short break and then resume." With a pale face, just like the stunned Kenny, I glared at his wife, who was frantically calling out to him. She, as if influenced by that gaze, slowly led Kenny out of the venue. When the reception resumed, Amy's parents were no longer present, but she had a refreshed expression, which gradually lifted the atmosphere. In the end, we were able to close it with smiles. Afterward, as the foreman was about to leave the venue, I stopped him and asked about the situation. He explained that despite being asked several times and having a brief conversation, Kenny had knelt and requested him to attend his daughter's wedding. so he reluctantly agreed to participate. When I murmured that it would have been nice if he had told me we were attending the same wedding, he scratched his head with a reluctant look and said, "I didn't think there was any need to say it. Anyway, that guy probably just wanted to somehow establish a connection with me." Even though it happened by chance, the fact that he helped me remains unchanged, so I lowered my head and said thank you. The foreman replied with a wry smile. I'd always tried not to treat people differently just because they're women, but when he said something like that, before he could finish, my older brother arrived and also lowered his head to the foreman, thanking him for responding to the sudden act. The foreman replied, "She is my top disciple, so being silent when someone goes that far is just unreasonable," patting my head. Vaguely remembering the past, I felt the size and warmth of his hand. I was captivated by the work of a carpenter when I was in elementary school. Whenever I had unpleasant experiences at home or school and needed to calm my feelings, I used to visit an old church. It was during one of those visits that I happened to come across the foremen who were repairing that church, and that's how it all began. I watched their work in a place where I wouldn't be in the way, and was completely captivated by their beautiful craftsmanship. From then on, I started researching the history of old buildings like churches and visited them in person. As I grew up, I sought out books about carpentry techniques and devoured them. I was completely enthralled by it all. And when I became a middle school student, I made a certain decision. The decision was that once I graduated from middle school, I would become an apprentice to a master carpenter specializing in old-style construction and learn the craft to become a top-notch carpenter myself. Naturally, my father strongly objected. He said it would be difficult for a woman and that there were more suitable places for a woman to work. He shook his head and refused to agree. But I couldn't give up. Day after day, I continued to persuade my parents. One day, seeing me in that state, my mother came into my room. I had been defeated by my father's arguments, lying face down on my bed. Sitting at the edge of the bed, my mother gently stroked my head and said, "I understand that becoming a carpenter is a challenging path, and I think I'm saying this because you know it. I won't oppose it, but you'll have to show your determination to your father." After thinking it over for a while, I felt that this was the only path for me. So I visited the construction company and lowered my head to the foreman, who had already been recognized as a living national treasure at that time. I asked him to take me as his apprentice. At first, I was turned away from a place where women weren't traditionally allowed to enter. However, I kept going for several months. Even if I couldn't get inside the shop, I continued to wait for the foreman to come out and kept bowing my head. Then during the winter of my second year in middle school, after numerous attempts at pleading, the foreman finally burst into laughter. He walked towards me, surprising me, and said, "I'm going to visit your parents right now." On the day when the foreman actually came to our house, my parents were bewildered. But the foreman bowed deeply in front of them and said, "This young woman will surely become a top-notch carpenter someday. I can see a burning passion in her eyes. Please believe in me and entrust your daughter to me." Saying so, the foreman looked at me with a kind gaze and gently placed his hand on my head. Even though my father still seemed reluctant, my mother, with tears welling up in her eyes, said, "Please take care of her." Seeing this, my father also lowered his head towards the foreman, holding back tears. And my older brother, who had witnessed many arguments between me and my father, looked at us with an indescribable expression. It's a memory that I still vividly recall to this day. While I was determined to take the first step towards my dream, the days that followed were by no means filled with only enjoyable moments. After graduating from middle school, and with my parents' permission, I moved into the apartment provided by the construction company and began learning the job. However, at first, I was often assigned to site cleanup, which was extremely physically demanding, and I struggled to keep up with my senior colleagues. Every time the work was delayed because of me, there were many instances where my senior colleagues got angry, saying things like, "This is what happens with women," or "Don't come here with half-hearted determination." Nevertheless, I didn't let it discourage me. I continued to watch and learn from the foreman and my senior colleagues' techniques, occasionally receiving guidance from the foreman himself. Before I knew it, I had grown to the point where I was entrusted with tasks alongside my senior colleagues. They began to acknowledge my skills more and started to smile and interact with me more. Finally, I started to find enjoyment in my work. I had thought that it would take much longer to earn the foreman's recognition, but just a while ago, he clearly stated that I am his top disciple. I was so happy and grinning, but then he reminded me not to get too carried away, saying there's still a lot to learn. It felt like the usual foreman had returned, and I couldn't help but straighten my posture. Watching the exchange between me and the foreman, my older brother chuckled and looked at me straight in the eye. "Emma, there's something I've wanted to say for a long time. Seeing you face your dream of becoming a carpenter head-on and working hard to make it a reality, well, it made me realize that I could do more. It inspired me to strive for the highest I could reach in my own studies, which led me to become a doctor and help many people. I believe that if I hadn't witnessed your determination that day, I would have lived a much less fulfilling life. So thank you truly." As he said this, I tightly squeezed my brother's outstretched hand while trying to hold back tears. It felt like a warm sensation was flowing into my heart, and both our parents and the foreman were watching us, brother and sister, with kind eyes. In the end, after that incident with Kenny and the fear of upsetting the living National Treasure foreman, Kenny experienced his first setback. Having never faced failure before, having graduated from a prestigious university, he struggled to bounce back from it, and eventually, he decided to step down from his position as chairman of an educational institution, passing it on to his successor. Amy shared this with me when she came to apologize to me again. She was apparently fed up with her father, who was obsessed with academic achievements, and her mother, who accommodated that mindset. So when I saw Amy laugh confidently and declare that she was cutting ties with them, I couldn't help but exchange a knowing smile with my brother, both of us chuckling. I continued to learn the craftsmanship of a carpenter under the foreman while working harmoniously with my senior colleagues. In reality, I'd taken on another job. It's a job that the school formally requested after receiving requests from students who had previously taken special lectures. I teach carpentry techniques at a construction-focused vocational school twice a week. Both jobs are fulfilling, and I am currently leading a very satisfying life. One day, when I reported about my work at the vocational school, the foreman suddenly burst into laughter with a joyful expression on his face. "If I hadn't met you, I probably wouldn't have allowed women on the construction side even now. And I never even thought about passing on my skills to people with such different aspirations like this. You're the one who changed me." Watching the foreman laugh like that, I couldn't help but smile, and I felt a warmth spreading through my heart. I thought to myself that it was a good decision to work here.
Hey everyone, I'm Jamie, and I've got a pretty interesting story to share about my mother-in-law, Sarah. Right now, Sarah doesn't really have a say in our lives because we've decided to cut ties with her. Getting to this point wasn't easy at all. Sarah is a classic example of a narcissist. I'm not a psychology expert, but she shows all the signs. She's self-centered and pretty awful, only ever thinking about herself. Interestingly, her son, my husband Paul, is the complete opposite. I think that's mostly because he was mostly raised by his dad after his parents split up when he was young. Sadly, he only reconnected with Sarah after his dad died from a serious illness. From what Paul's told me, it's clear that Sarah is really controlling and manipulative. Paul once told me, "Jamie, my mom expects so much from me. She thinks she's entitled to everything I have and expects me to take care of her forever." He shared how she used to take all his money when he started working during school. For a long time, Paul thought this was normal parental stuff, but it's not healthy. I told him you were basically her servant, working while she did nothing. "But you've got to make some serious financial changes, Paul," I urged. "I know, Jamie," he replied. "I've tried talking to her, but she always guilt trips me about abandoning her or leaving her to fend for herself. I even suggested she get a job, but she refuses to listen." Paul struggled to manage his student loans since he was financially supporting Sarah throughout college. She stopped working when Paul was 17, the same year he got his first job. From then on, he was designated as the family's primary breadwinner, isolated from their extended family and under Sarah's stringent control. He had always considered this dynamic to be normal. He didn't have friends because Sarah didn't allow it, and he couldn't afford a phone. When Paul went to college, he was introduced to a whole new world. Despite Sarah's attempts to prevent him from attending, he pursued higher education. It was there, away from his mother's overwhelming influence and meeting a variety of people, that he finally realized the abnormality of his upbringing. "Paul, your mother has been quite abusive towards you," I told him. "She's manipulated you for years and even squandered the inheritance your father left. Why do you continue to support her?" "What can I do, Jamie?" Paul replied, his voice tinged with resignation. "After hearing for years that she deserves my money, it's hard to shake off. I can't completely cut her off. She's the only family I have left apart from you." "I understand," I said gently, "but you need to reconsider your situation. You're drowning in debt. How much longer can you manage this?" Paul didn't have an answer. He realized that continuing to support Sarah meant he could never escape his financial burdens. This situation also made me question our future together. I was aware that Sarah could become a significant issue, potentially claiming a stake in everything we owned. She already disliked me, resentful of the bond Paul and I shared. "Don't think you can take my son and his money," Sarah would snap at me. "I'm his mother, and the only one who deserves his things. You're just a gold digger trying to steal my son." "You need to stop relying on Paul," I retorted. "He's an adult, and so are you. You're perfectly capable of taking care of yourself." "Shut up, girl. Don't tell me how to live my life. I won't lose my lifestyle for a worthless girl like you." "Paul will always be under my control, and I'll make sure of it," she replied sharply. Sarah's harsh words were alarming, but I was determined to stand up for Paul. Unlike him, I had a strong backbone and a flair for subtle revenge, which allowed me to handle Sarah without letting her harm us too deeply. Although I often endured her insults, I found them bearable. As the years passed, both Paul and I finished college. I began working in a studio, and Paul landed an excellent job as a graphic designer. Despite his difficult upbringing, he was a diligent student and achieved considerable success. Nevertheless, Sarah continued to exploit his finances relentlessly. When Paul and I got engaged, Sarah was furious. She accused him of marrying a gold digger and worried aloud about her welfare. "How can you even think of getting married now? You still need to take care of me. Getting married would be a bad financial decision," she argued. "Mom, I'm already taking care of you, and getting married won't change that," Paul reassured her. But Sarah wasn't convinced. "But your wife will take all your money. You'll have nothing left for me. She doesn't earn much, and her mother is no help either. They'll both just become a burden to you." "Excuse me, but my mom and I are perfectly capable of managing on our own. We don't need to rely on your son," I interjected calmly, although internally I seethed at her accusation. I avoided telling her that she was the actual financial burden. I knew it would only ignite a pointless argument, and I preferred to keep the peace. Sarah interpreted my silence as an opportunity to further insult me and my family. My family, valuing respectability, chose not to retaliate against her barbs, preferring not to stoop to arguing with a narcissist. That was until one day something alarming happened. While I was at work, my mom called, puzzled and concerned. "Jamie, why is your stuff at my house?" "Did something happen with Paul?" she asked. "What are you talking about, Mom? Nothing has happened between us." "How do you know it's my stuff?" I replied, confused. "The moving guys told me your name," she explained. This unexpected turn of events hinted at Sarah's deeper meddling, a dark reminder that ignoring her might no longer suffice. When my mom called, she was understandably confused and alarmed. "Jamie, your boxes arrived here with your name and address on them. I've opened a few and they're filled with your clothes. What's going on? Did the movers say who sent them?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. "I think you should come home right away and sort this out," she advised. Taking her advice, I immediately left work and rushed home. As I entered my bedroom, a shocking sight greeted me. My drawers and closet were empty, even my bath products were gone. I was stunned. Descending to the living room, I found Sarah there wearing a smug expression. "What the hell is going on, Sarah? Why did you touch my stuff and send it to my mom's house?" I demanded, trying to keep my composure. Sarah's response was chilling. I'm here to set things right. From now on, only the homeowner and his mother will live in this house. A mother always has more rights than a wife. It's unfair for you to live here. What are you talking about? You're out of your mind. I shot back, my anger rising. Since the house belongs to my son, only he and I will stay here. You will leave and go to a house that is in your name. So you're saying only the person who owns the house should stay here? I clarified, trying to understand her twisted logic. That's exactly what I mean. Now, since I've already sent your stuff away, you can just leave. Don't worry, my son and I will be very happy here, she declared, then turned and went upstairs. I was furious at her audacity, unable to believe she tried to throw me out of my own house. This house was in my name, and I was the rightful occupant. I couldn't let her force me out without taking action. So I made a strategic call and immediately phoned Paul, urging him to come home as quickly as possible. He said he'd be home soon and would reach me in no time. Despite Sarah's attempts to disrupt our wedding plans, Paul handled the situation well. Although it frustrated him, he still couldn't bring himself to completely sever ties with his mother. After our wedding, we settled into our new home. The details of how we acquired the house aren't pertinent right now, but Sarah was livid when she found out. She called me fuming. So you've already started messing with my son's money, buying expensive houses without even discussing it with me, she accused. I have no idea what you're talking about, Sarah. Besides, how Paul and I handle our finances is none of your business, I replied, cutting the conversation short. Her resentment was palpable. You think you can live in a big house while I'm stuck in this small rented apartment? Mark my words, Jamie, you won't enjoy my son's house alone. At the time, I didn't take Sarah's threats seriously. She had a habit of making such dramatic statements, and I had also developed a habit of ignoring her and not giving her the reaction she wanted. I relayed to my mom when she arrived at our house to check on the situation. We were both deeply unsettled, but I knew we needed to stand our ground and confront this outrageous attempt by Sarah to usurp our home. When Sarah saw my mother, she was visibly flustered. What the hell, Jen? Why is your mother here? I told you that you and your family can't be here. I've already sent your stuff to your mother's place, Sarah exclaimed. Then why is she here? I replied with a smirk. Well, you said that from now on, only the homeowner and the mother can stay here. So I called my mother and invited her over. This house is owned by my son. You should not be here, Sarah countered sharply. I demand you to leave as soon as possible. I couldn't help but laugh, finding the irony too delicious, and my mother joined in. Though I was angry, the laughter was a welcome relief because I knew what needed to be clarified next. Once we composed ourselves, I turned to Sarah with a calm demeanor. Just for your information, my dear mother-in-law, this house belongs to me, I began, my tone even but firm. Yes, this house is in my name. It was part of my inheritance from my grandfather who passed away recently. You can't be telling the truth. I don't believe you. This house cannot be yours. I know my son got this house for you, Sarah spluttered, disbelief etched across her face. Just wait till he comes home and shows you your place. I will not tolerate you keeping me away from the house, Sarah continued. Sarah's confusion was met with a blue correction from my mother. She's telling the truth, Sarah. You have some messed up logic about deserving your son's things. Even if the house is Jamie's, you shouldn't be so entitled. Jamie is Paul's wife and is equally entitled to his assets. I don't take advice from freeloaders, Rebecca, Sarah snapped back. I would suggest you keep your mouth shut. As for Paul, I will stay with him and make sure he divorces Jamie soon. Just a few minutes later, Paul walked through the front door, clearly bewildered by the sight of his mother standing in the middle of our living room and even more puzzled to see my mother, whom I hadn't told him I invited over. Hey guys, what's going on here? He asked as he entered. Something has happened, Paul. Your overbearing wife and her mother are trying to take over your house. I have come here to save you from this monstrous family, Sarah declared. Dramatically, Paul, taken aback, responded firmly, Mom, what the hell is going on? Why would you disrespect my wife and her mother? They are standing right here. He then turned to me, giving me the floor to explain. Let me tell you what happened, I began, ready to unveil the entire absurd scenario Sarah had orchestrated. Paul stood in the middle of our living room, utterly stunned as he processed what I had just explained. Oh my God, are you serious, Mom? Did you pack up Jamie's belongings and send them to her mom's house? Did you come into our home and move our things? Who gave you the right to do that? Paul asked, his voice filled with disbelief. I'm just trying to help you, Paul, Sarah protested with feigned innocence. You need to reconsider your marriage. I've been telling you not to tolerate her freeloading behavior. Trust me, I can find you a better wife. Mom, I've told you so many times not to interfere in my marriage. Why are you still doing this? Paul's voice was firm, his frustration clear. Sarah retorted, her tone escalating. I'm standing up for you, Paul. Your wife will drain your finances if you don't end this. That's why I moved into your house. I'm going to stay with you. You need to stop saying it's his house. I interjected firmly, Sarah, I've already told you this house is mine. If any mother is staying, it will be mine. Paul looked exasperated as Sarah continued her tirade. Look at what your witch wife is saying. I told you she's a gold digger. She's already claiming that this house is hers. Mom, stop insulting Jamie. This is ridiculous. Paul snapped, his patience worn thin. She's right, the house belongs to Jamie. It was part of her inheritance after her grandfather passed away. Sarah's face turned ashen as the truth finally seemed to dawn on her. My mother chuckled slightly from the corner, enjoying Sarah's discomfort, while Paul looked like he was on the verge of losing his temper completely. Sarah tried to regain her composure, scrambling for another angle. It doesn't matter since you two are married. This house is yours too, Paul. I have the right to stay here. Why should I live in a rented apartment when you have a house? I won't let Jamie take everything from me. You need to kick her out, Sarah insisted stubbornly. Mom, you need to leave, Paul declared, his voice rising. I've had enough of you meddling in my marriage. No matter how much you dislike Jamie, I am not leaving her. I've always made that abundantly clear. You've gone too far with your antics. There is no way you are staying here. Your wife is blackmailing you with the house, Paul. You can't stay with her. Trust me, it will be so much better if you divorce her. I will find you a new wife. Sarah tried to manipulate further. The situation spiraled into chaos. Paul began to shout at Sarah, his anger boiling over. I was equally furious, and my voice joined the tumult as Sarah tried to defend her indefensible actions. The tension was palpable, and it was clear that something had to give in this confrontation. When I had finally had enough, I took decisive action and kicked Sarah out. She looked desperately at Paul for support, but he couldn't even bring himself to meet her eyes. I went to the guest room, grabbed her suitcases, and threw them out the door alongside her. Sarah spent a solid hour weeping on our doorstep until I warned her that I would call the police if she didn't leave. Eventually, she got up and left inside. Paul was overwhelmed with guilt and began to apologize profusely. My mom discreetly went into the kitchen to give us some privacy. Jamie, I'm so sorry. I should have cut ties with my mom a long time ago. All these years, she kept attacking you, and I still allowed her in our lives. I thought she might change and accept you as my wife, but it's clear now she never will, he lamented. Paul, I understand she's your mom and you felt the duty to take care of her. But her behavior has been unbearable. She tried to kick me out of my own home. I responded, my voice firm yet weary. I know Jamie, and I can't believe she went that far. But don't worry, she won't get away with this. I'm going to stop supporting her financially. She doesn't deserve my kindness after what she's done. You won't have to deal with her again, Paul promised, his tone resolute. We spent a long time discussing our boundaries and expectations moving forward, reaching a solid understanding that brought me considerable relief. To lighten the mood, my mom stayed for lunch, and we ordered some delicious meals through DoorDash. Despite the morning's upheaval, the day turned out fairly well, except for my belongings being displaced. It was satisfying in a way to finally show Sarah that her behavior was unacceptable. My mother had spoken to the moving company when they arrived at her place and explained the situation. They agreed to return my belongings, though it would take some time. In the meantime, Sarah didn't cease her attempts to stir trouble. She bombarded Paul with calls and sent me a flurry of texts accusing me of controlling him and forcing him to cut her off. I showed all her messages to Paul, who was livid and found himself in several heated exchanges with his mother over the following days. It felt like we were trapped in an endless cycle. That cycle finally broke when we decided it was time to take legal action. We reported Sarah to the police, pressing charges of trespassing, theft, and harassment. The police were quite taken aback by the extent of her actions and took our complaint seriously. Sarah might not have been violent, but her actions were far from rational. After the incident, we informed her that we had filed a police report and our lawyers began the process of obtaining a restraining order. However, this didn't deter her. She showed up at our house, furious and unapologetic. "How dare you file a police report against me? I'm your mother, and I deserve respect. Paul, you can't do this to me," she screamed at us. "I'm done being quiet every time you overstep. What you did was a criminal offense. I don't care what the law says. I'm entitled to be in this house. You've even stopped paying me money. I have nowhere to go. You know I ended my lease to live here. I demand you let me in and remove the police report," she continued, her voice filled with rage. "That will never happen, Mom. Besides, you don't deserve my money after trying to destroy my marriage," Paul replied firmly. I added, "Sarah, you need to stop shouting at our door. We've decided that only the homeowner and her mother will stay here from now on. Since you are neither, you need to leave." My words pushed Sarah over the edge, causing her to have a breakdown right on our doorstep. The neighbors started to peek out of their homes, drawn by the commotion. It was quite embarrassing. At one point, a neighbor approached our front door to ask if he should call the police. When Sarah lunged at him and shouted, he didn't hesitate to dial 911 and let them listen to what Sarah was saying. My mother-in-law continued her tirade until the police arrived and arrested her. This unfortunate spectacle provided us with the necessary evidence to secure a restraining order. Given that Sarah had also been harassing my mother, Paul suggested a surprising solution. "Jamie, I think we should let your mom stay with us for a while," he proposed. "Sarah knows her address and won't stop harassing her. She's becoming increasingly unhinged, and I'm worried she might escalate her behavior. It would be safest if Rebecca stayed here." "Are you sure about this, Paul?" "I don't want you to feel uncomfortable with her living here, and I don't think Mom would want to impose," I responded, concerned about how the dynamics might affect him. Paul assured me, "I feel bad for Rebecca, and it's the right thing to do. I don't mind at all. It's better for everyone's peace of mind if she stays with us for now." He reassured me, saying, "I know Rebecca is a reasonable person, Jamie. I have no problem with her staying here. She's very respectful of our boundaries. Besides, only the homeowner and her mother can stay here, right?" That joke between us brought out a hearty laugh, lightening the mood despite the circumstances. I could see that Paul was still struggling with the fallout from his mother's actions, but he was earnestly trying to distance himself from Sarah's toxic influence. Cutting ties with a narcissistic parent is a complex and painful process. We've been discussing therapy for Paul to help him navigate these emotional waters. He's open to the idea but needs some time to organize his thoughts. Understanding his mental state, I'm doing my best to support him. Meanwhile, Sarah, cut off from directly contacting us, has been trying to appeal to my mom, Rebecca, to garner sympathy. She laments about how unfairly she's been treated, claiming she has nowhere to go and is now living in her car. Over the years, Sarah has alienated so many people that no one is willing to take her in. Paul remains firm in his decision not to support her financially anymore, forcing Sarah to face the reality of finding a job, an idea that terrifies her, especially with several police reports and an arrest on her record. We've reached a point where we are indifferent to her plight. I can candidly say that I am relieved to see Sarah facing the consequences of her actions. This tough love is long overdue, and while it's harsh, it's necessary for our peace and to finally bring some sanity back into our lives.